I want to start out by thanking Majean Daniels, who just joined us, who always does the publicity for these events and has done it without complaint for months on end. And thanks to both Mary Bloodworth and Judy Berman for the tech support behind this out of the village. Also, I want to remind you that next month, our speaker is going to be Connie Citro, our great expert on the census. She's going to try to tell us what happened to the 2020 census and what it all means for redistricting and the House of Representatives.
Wow.
Really cool and colorful.
Very important.
Next month. And then in June, we have Christian Osterman, who has just written a book on the last of the East German secret police chiefs and how that all evolved. And so we'll look at a German question and a police question in June. Then we'll take vacation July, August, and we'll be back with you in September.
Mhm.
So remind yourselves to mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you very much. Michelle's going to talk for a while. I'm going to ask a few questions and then we'll open it up for general questions and we'll close at 7 o'clock. So with that, let me introduce Michele Murdock. She has a distinction. She is our first ever Village Voices speaker who does not live on the Hill. She did until about 3 weeks ago, and we had no idea she was not going to be a Hillite until this happened. So Michele, you have a rare distinction. We don't have non-Hill people talk. Michele has written this book on an extraordinary woman that she's going to tell us about, Sister Dorothy Stang, and her adventures and tragic death in the Amazon. Michele.
Thank you, Trudy. And thank you for inviting me, even though I did step away from the Hill 3 weeks ago. But we are keeping our social membership as long as the board accepts that. And I see Judy shaking her head, yes. Yeah, we hated to leave in many ways, but it's a long story why we did, and we're very happy. Sarah Stein, who is my daughter-in-law, and her husband, our son, and a 6-year-old, almost 6-year-old Jackson are living with us now, and that was part of the plan. So that's why we're living 20 minutes away. And I wanted to thank Franzinello too. She is the one who kind of mentioned that I had written this book. It is not a new book, but it continues to pique people's interest from time to time. I also want to thank the village in general for its dedication now to anti-racist and non-supremacist education. And Dorothy Stang's story fits right in, as you will hear. Who was she? She was a nun. She was a sister of Notre Dame de Namur from Ohio originally. The Ohio province is pretty strong still in that order, even though many sisters are leaving or passing away. But Trinity College, where I was, my alma mater, which is now Trinity Washington University, was founded by those sisters. So I had a little affinity for her, even though I did not know her. But most people know about her murder more than they know of other things. So I will tell you more about that. But I chose a piece to show her legacy, a little piece of video, which my daughter-in-law will now screen share with me. Here's a bit of her.
We see a terrible climate change, and that's one of the big things that makes me as a person work. When I came here, we had 9 months of rain, and we're down now to 5 or 6 months of rain. We sometimes go 100 days, 120 days with not a drop of rain. Our water level is dropping. People have to keep, because everybody has a well in their little yard, and they have to keep deepening that well, which tells everybody the water level is dropping. I feel we're all responsible to reduce global warming so that there's a tomorrow, so that there's a chance for people to live and enjoy the beauties of this magnificent world that I've had the chance to live. One of the things that we really feel here is the arrogance of the Northern Hemisphere people. We feel they're very capitalistic and they're very terrible consumer society. And so they're getting many of the benefits of our tremendous forest products because much money was lent to Brazil in the past. And now they're getting our forest products back in a way in payment. Everybody can, in a very democratic way, can share in these world's gifts. If they've been invented, why should only a few share in them? Why can't more people share in the marvelous creativity that has come to our planet? Our people live very simply and happily without having so many things. So we have to learn to have the necessary things of life and not ask ourselves, what do we want, but what do I need?
Thank you, Sarah. So I just wanted to give you a little look at her because it's still kind of a mystery of who she was, I think, for a lot of people. And yet, just a little bit of a bio on her is that she did enter the convent in Ohio at the age of 16 with a friend whose name was Joan Krim, and Joan was 17. And they decided after hearing a missionary from China that they ought to do something like that. So they went to the order, and then Dorothy was sent to Arizona after formation and some education. And she was there for 13 years and became the principal of a school in a suburb of Phoenix, where she taught science and religion and also football because she had learned to play with her brothers. And she's one of course, 9 children from an area called Shiloh, I guess, outside of Dayton, which was a pretty Catholic area. She was born during the Depression, and they had a victory garden of about a ½ acre. And part of her great love of farming and of the woods and the trees and the crops was really garnered at that time with her father, who knew a lot about farming, and she learned from him. After 13 years in Arizona, she answered what I call the call we do. Vatican II came along, and they were looking, the Pope John the 23rd was looking at Latin America, where many peasants, really offspring of slaves, were baptized, of course. The country was pretty Catholic at that point, and in 62. And she heard that they were looking for volunteers, and so had a number of people in the order. So 5 sisters in 1966 embarked for Brazil. Now, people ask me if I'm a nun. I have not been a nun, nor never was, but I am a cradle Catholic. So some of this was not unfamiliar to me. There was a sister in my mother's family who was in Malawi. And so I had some affinity for the sisters who were missionaries. But how did I come to write the book? Because I was a media producer. I had a small business in New York City. And eventually I was preparing for retirement, and I always read a lot of mystery stories, and a brochure came across our mailbox one day, how to write a thriller, a course at Sarah Lawrence College. So I thought, aha, I'll learn how to do this, and I'll maybe write a good mystery. And then I was having a terrible time finding a story. And so our wonderful teacher said, look in the newspaper. And sure enough, there was a small clip about this nun, Dorothy Stang, who was murdered. And I was like, uh-oh, but I knew the order. I thought, well, maybe I can get a little more information. So I started to think I would fictionalize the story. But of course, I was breaking all the rules that I was learning. You're supposed to learn, right from what you know. I didn't know blank about Brazil to speak of. And so I still sort of, it stayed with me. And I did find that clipping. And then I was also really engaged with the thought of who would kill a nun. I was kind of naive, I think, and I had also forgotten. I did know about the murder of the Maryknoll sisters and an Ursuline sister in El Salvador years before, but it just didn't occur to me. So I started to think, how could I find out more? And I did contacted the college, and I eventually was put in touch with the sisters in Ohio. And they said, oh, you have been in educational films? Well, come out. So I went out. In 2 weeks I was there. They were doing a lot of materials about Dorothy at that point. And I thought maybe I would do something in video because that was my business. But in fact, they already had 2 videos going, one of which you just saw a piece of. And so I went back home and I said, well, all right, maybe I could do a book. And that's where it started. I went back to see the sisters. I was able to look through over 100 letters. She was an incredible, prolific writer. I still don't know how she did it, probably waiting by the side of the road for those buses to come through the Trans-Amazon, called a highway, but you know, it's more of a rutted road at that point. She had a lot of friends in the order. So I went back to Ohio. I did research there. I talked to the family. But probably what really propelled the book along, although I had started writing a nonfiction, kind of creative nonfiction, is I was able to go to the trial of the rancher who was part of a conspiracy. And so with Sister Joan Krim, which was Dorothy's friend, I took the plane and we went off to Beleng, and I stayed 9 days with the sisters and learned a lot about what they call their charism, their belief, their philosophy. Dorothy sort of emulates that, I think, dramatically. The world really opened to me too, to understand impunity, which I really didn't know that much about. It was pretty life-changing in many ways. The trial, I will say, 2 days is what they take for a trial like that, for a criminal trial. And the first night we were there till 10:30 at night. The next day it was over by about 4 in the afternoon. Happily, it ended that the rancher who was convicted of conspiracy was convicted temporarily because he was out on appeal the next year, which is, again, it's about impunity and, you know, right, they have a right, is what they felt. Why was she killed? She was killed because her major piece of her legacy was something called the Project for Sustainable Development, the PDS. And I want to talk a little bit about how she used to do these community building, which is sort of the foundation of this. But the reason that this rancher was convicted is that his land abutted the land that had been given to a farm worker named Luis. And Luis's one night was taken out of the house with his family, and their house was burned down. And that was fairly typical of what would happen, because Luis's farm, which was given to him by the government in this Project for Sustainable Development, his lot was abutted the ranch. And the rancher felt that he had a right to do that. So with that in mind, I began to understand really what we were looking at, so I could come back and at least write a little bit more clearly. And I wanted to say, how did she get started on that journey that, you know, ended her life? She had gone with the rest of them to a place outside of Rio called Petropolis. There was a learning center there for Catholic educators. And she was trained for 4 months in the language, as were the others. And then she was traveled to a town called Coroata. Sarah, maybe I could have one of the maps. We'll look at Brazil for a minute, and we can just look at the there. This is obviously Brazil, the largest country, a huge country in South America. And she started out at the bottom there. It's you can barely see, I guess you can see Rio Grande do Sul, and Rio de Janeiro is right down there. And then she went to that shaded area there. She worked through all of that area where there's a state called Maranhão, and then she went to Pará, which is the wild west of Brazil. In Coroata, she and the sisters realized that they were not being so successful at the beginning, because even though they were knocking on doors and inviting people to come to their prayer meetings and to learn some of their faith, because none of them had ever been, most of them were illiterate. Most of the peasant class was illiterate. And as one of the sisters said to me recently, most of them had never held a book, never mind the Bible. So there was tremendous learning that had to be done, but they were not getting a group together as they thought they should. And it turns out they realized through a conversation with a young teacher that they were really still consorting, if you will, with the affluent and illiterate people. And they really had to learn to dress like and to eat like and to live like the poor. They were, after all, to be an option for the poor. That was the call from the Vatican. So they learned that in the first place. But what else happened is there was a military government that came in. And some of you may have been in Brazil, for all I know, but I meant to ask you, but you can tell me later. The military government, when it came in, was very concerned about some peasant rebellions that were going on. And so they decided that they would give land for the people without land. So they did have an agrarian reform going on. Some of the people that Dorothy knew in the area of Coroatá, which is the state next to Para, she said, I'll go with them because nobody will know how to build constituents, to build communities in that area. So she and a young sister called Becky, left with some of the peasant families from Coroatá to go there and to get some of this land. They did, and they began to be popular with their Bible faith-based community development. And people, because of the fact that they were explaining the stories, that people loved the stories, they also liked the fact that what these women were doing was relating it to the lives of the people that they were talking to, and realizing that maybe they too could be led out of Egypt into the happier land with a God that really cared for them. So with that in mind, the military did not like what Dorothy and Rebecca were doing. And in fact, some priest in another area turned them in to the military tribunal or whatever it was. And they made her come with Becky to answer why, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm teaching, Bible studies and teaching literacy. And he said, okay, but if you are doing anything political, we will be there for you. And we will come and look at what you're doing, and we will take action. So that happened a few times, and at that particular place on the border of Para. So what she did was to say, I think I better get moving. And she had heard that a bishop further north in a place called Altamira, and maybe Sarah, I could have that map now, the last one, right? So she had come from Maranhão all the way along. There's a little town called Abel Figueiredo, and then there's Jacunda, and eventually she got to Altamira, which is on the Xingu River, and there's a reason for my telling you about the river, which I'll get to at the very end. Altamira is where the bishop was, and he said, well, yeah, I see she again had a letter introducing herself, and she was in that area. I just want you to see there's Anapu and there's also Nazaré, and you can take that down, but that's kind of the area in which she worked. Now, Belém was all the way up by the water, so it was a long trip, but excuse me, Belém is where they had what you might call a mother house. It was really a place for them to go later. So anyway, they went to Altamira. She talked to the bishop, and he said he was supposed to be relocating 100,000 peasants. It's a lot of people. And she said, well, why don't you give me the area that is the most needy? So he said, okay. And he started sending her out with a priest who had already been trying to do community building. and he was doing okay with it. And she, of course, was experienced. So with that, she was able to move on into the woods, further and further into the woods. One of my friends recently asked me, well, exactly how did she work? So I'm going to read you one passage from my book here, because I think it's a little more, it's probably better in this way than if I were to tell you. Our whole emphasis at that time was to help those small groups isolated out there in the woods to create strong communal ties. And once they were created, to build strong base Christian communities. There were no villages. It was important for the people to identify themselves publicly as organized. So we worked on creating infrastructure, a school, a little parish center, roads that went into the forest, little stores. When she had a small group together, Dorothy talked about the power and strength of communities. Together, they studied the Gospels for inspiration. She spoke about how they could stand together in the face of crises, disease, lost jobs, and of course, land struggles. And I think immediately of the villages and how we stand together or have stood together in that kind of situation too. So the power of community is what really, I think, made her able to keep working, but also it eventually became a problem, but I'll go on to that. She had an amazing way of, you could see it, I think maybe in that film clip. She was extremely charming, but she was also extremely tenacious. So sometimes with some of these people who were able to get land, they couldn't get the deeds because, again, the government really didn't want them to have rights to the land. They just wanted to say they could have land for a while, and they would give them a hoe and a shovel and some seed for, I believe, the food manioc, which was sort of a constant, not a constant, but a, basic in their diets. And that was it. So some of them wanted to put a stake in the ground and live the way they were supposed to. So she would help them get the deeds. And one day, for example, I was told, she took the bus to Belém, to the management office of INCRA. And she got there late. So she slept on the bench outside the door of the manager, whom she knew. And when it became morning, she went to the office, and the man said, "Oh, good morning, Sister Dorothy. What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, I came about a lease for land for so-and-so." He said, "Well, all right." But he said, "I never saw it." And she sat at his desk and saw a pile of papers. And so she just said, "May I?" And she starts going through the papers, and she found the paper that she had helped to write for the people. And so she said, "Here it is. If you would sign it, now we could." And that was the kind of thing that she did from time to time. So in the end, she built 30 schools during her time. Some of them were small in-home house schools. Some of them were brick and mortar. One of the things that I thought was so remarkable was that in one of those little towns around Altamira called Nazaré, she built an education center. So they put up dormitories so people could come and be trained in education. So she wasn't, just pushing it off. She was really trying to better the lot of all these people and take it seriously. And I think that is what really impressed me in a lot of ways. Her legacy was also sustainable development. That was really what she saw. She had been known to be an environmentalist. Little by little, people, she was trying to make people aware of the fact that they should only farm what they could use and grow to sell to market, but not cut down a gazillion trees because they didn't need a gazillion trees. She had been at a 1992 conference in Rio, which was a worldwide environmental conference. And she joined, she did some speaking, but then she went outside because people were outside who weren't let in. And she went and joined them to march around. people in Brazil seem to like to march, much like we do in Washington anyway, when it's not a COVID time. So based on this belief in sustainable development, you kind of hear the roots of that in what she had to say. She was able to gather people from some of the more successful settlers, farmer settlers. She was able to gather together these people so that they could write a proposal for something called the Project for Sustainable Development. Project for Sustainable Development was to give each farm family who could do it, who had proven that they were successful at farming, reasonably anyway, against other odds, give them 250-acre plots where they could live, build a house, and they could have farm animals, and they could have pigs and chicken, and they could have crops to feed themselves and crops to sell to market. It was approved by the government in 2004, and she was, of course, thrilled. It was her whole goal in those community development for people who wanted to stay in the Amazon region. This was really what she was driving for. She got a lot of accolades for it. She got the Bar Association of Brazil made a special prize for her. She became Woman of the Year for the state of Pará. All that sounds good, but there was also a $25,000 prize on her head. She was in the crosshairs. I think that they tolerated her for many years, but when she finally had this success, there was just no stopping a group of rancher cattlemen who wanted to stop her. And they felt that she would be the ones who, she was the one. If they cut off the head of the snake, it wouldn't go away. Didn't happen. And one of the things that happened at the trial that I was aware of is there was a man, I saw him go in when the buses came from the town of Arapu. They were going to the big city in Belém, to the courthouse. And I saw this very small Indian looking man going in with them. And turned out he had overheard a group of ranchers talking about killing Dorothy. He freaked, and he would not, he couldn't become a witness they were going to put him on the stand. It was probably just all too much for him. And so they didn't. And yet at the end of the trial, Bida was convicted. Everybody broke into, I would say, modest applause, which is not done in any courtroom as far as I know, but in any case it was. But Dorothy, just how this happened, and some of you may know the story, but so there was this conflict between Bida and this Luis, who was now a farmer who had one of these plots of 250 acres. He left when his house was burned and went to the city for a while. And in the meantime, Dorothy was asked if she would come to this community, which she had helped to found. Would she come to help mediate? And they knew that she had some of the papers that would have shown that Luis had a right to the land. So she goes down to this place called Esperanza, which of course is hope, which is ironic. And she stays with another farmer. And the next morning she starts out to go to the meeting to try to mediate between the people who were accusing Luis of taking land, and Luis's people say no. And she was walking along, and she was to be followed by a man who was her friend, but he was late in following her. So she's walking along a street, a rutted road really, and there are two young men sowing grass seed, which is how they do for the cattle, that three-week grass seed. So she spoke to them, said, good morning. And, I'm going to this meeting and you could maybe get some land yourselves. And they, just blew it off, and she just kept walking. And then they turned around and said, "Sister Dorothy," and she turned around and they whipped out the gun and shot her. They shot her once, and then they shot her 5 times as she lay in the ground. So it was a terrible event for all of these people, including obviously the sisters. But the trial 2 years later had been prepared by these nuns. So I spent the time with them the week before with a lot of people coming and going in the house. I don't speak Portuguese, but some of them were speaking in English, some were speaking in Portuguese. People were coming and going to support the effort to try to bring justice. And in fact, in the end, that's what happened. But I will describe the courthouse or the courtroom with 2 sides, and one side was filled up with the supporters of Sister Dorothy. Sisters who were in mission in Brazil all had come, so there were a number of them. On the other side were the rancher families, and there you saw, here were the sisters dressed in t-shirts and slacks and then there were the others. There's a lot of activity in the courtroom, unlike ours. And one of the 2 things that really impressed me were behind the judge's seat, and he really sat at a table with some other people there. Above him was a huge oil painting of Lady Justice. He was sitting below that, dressed in a black robe with ermine cuffs. And I mean, to me, it was just so much of the throwback of Brazil and the history of the Latin America. The prosecutor, who was wonderful and very emotional, was dressed in what looked like a cassock with a belt and a rosette of white tied at the waist. The lawyers from the other side were from the South, which was that was part of the conversation, that the ranchers would hire a team of lawyers who would be able to, get him off. They, at one point, the oldest lawyer, the senior member of the team, grabbed the Brazilian flag, pulled it toward himself, and wrapped himself in the flag. And then he said, Dorothy Stang is an American trying to exploit Brazil, and she is, her death is what we would expect. I had never seen anything like that anyway, even in Perry Mason and, the British mysteries that I love to watch. So it just opened up a whole inexplicable world to me that I began to understand. I was a lot of times I was around them while they were speaking Portuguese, but I was very lucky because people would come and sit with me at the trial and explain what was going on. Her legacy is such that PDS is still going. If I say strong or thriving, it's probably too much, but there are definitely more and more families who come there. Even if they didn't know Dorothy, they know her spirit and they want to be part of the struggle, and they believe in having land, and they get their 250 acres. I'm not sure how many plots are farmed now, but I know that when the sisters, there are 2 sisters there now. I saw them on tape recently, and what they say is the people are doing well. There are many people who go out, get college degrees, come back. It's a functioning area of the Amazon, for sure. And the people are not the problem, but the problem, of course, is the politics of Brazil at this point. And so they have that struggle to go through. But the sisters are there. And she said, one of them said, she was asked, what was Dorothy, do they understand Dorothy's work? And she said, we are Dorothy. We have become Dorothy. So there is a sense that that kind of struggle continues, and the legacy that she has is right there in Brazil, in the Amazon. I could say a lot more, as you can see, but I think that my time has gone over. So I'm happy to hear from Trudy and questions, and if there are some.
Thank you very much, Michele. Let me ask a question or two just to get us started. You mentioned that early on she was, quotes, turned in by a priest who didn't appreciate what she was doing.
Yeah.
That's a constant story when we look at the killings of the nuns in Central America. The conflict between liberation theology and people who believe that the old pastoral regime was what should be done. How did that play into her murder, do you think, or did it?
Oh, I think it probably did. I mean, there were other murders, as you say, and her branch, her brand of Catholicism, their community focus. There are those who would much rather go back to the old. I think it's probably pretty much part of the fabric of the killings. I mean, I'm not sure that answers your question. But
let me ask another one then. Some of the nuns that are in these missions also do what is called, I think, reverse missioning, try to explain to the US population what's going on and try to get US policies to change. Part of that sort of reverse missioning?
I know that reverse missioning yeah, I mean, they worked with, what I know about that particular story is they worked with a mission office in a particular parish in Ohio. So there was the back and forth. From that, some politicians or some representatives knew a lot about it, and they did after her murder. They certainly did try to hold her up as a particular, a kind of a beacon of the kind of work that they were doing in Brazil, certainly. But I think I don't think they were really involved in anything like reverse missioning in terms of trying to influence policy. They really wanted, they were just trying to get the people organized.
Finally, what did the United States do after she was killed? She is a US citizen killed in Brazil, after all.
That's right. So they sent a group from the FBI down to Brazil to find out exactly what had happened. I don't know how much of it they ever really did find out. But there was, clearly the State Department was on the phone to Ohio immediately and offered to bring her back to the country here, bring her body back. And they said no, she had become a Brazilian citizen a couple of years before. And because she wanted to stay there. I mean, she had the opportunity to come back to the States several times. The order would have happily brought her back. In fact, the person I work closely with, Sister Liz, offered that to her right just before she was killed, the year before. And she said, no, she said, these are my people. And she was in Brazil 40 years. So she was really more Brazilian, I think, than she was American in some ways. In terms of what else, I don't know what else the State Department tried to do, but I know that they wanted to investigate. And there was a team of lawyers, American lawyers, who were at that trial, but I was not really informed as to what I think they helped with trying to get the conviction of the conspirators.
Okay, let's open it up. If you just wave your hand and then unmute yourself, and Judy Canning's got a hand up immediately.
Yeah, Michele, I didn't get what year it was that she died and what year you attended the trial.
Okay, so she died in February of 2005, and I was there in, I'd say, May of 2007. Yeah. So
And-
took them. Yes. go
And
ahead.
your book was published when?
2010, it's Christmas time, 2010, 2000, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, she was an amazing person. And I will say, go ahead, somebody else has you go ahead.
Roberta Gutman.
Yeah, it's Roberta
Roberta?
Gutman here. You alluded to this sort of collusion or what have you of a priest of the traditional Catholic order
Yeah,
versus these nuns. That's appalling.
yes, it
It's
certainly is.
appalling.
But that kind of thing happens even today in, the factions in any system, I guess, happens. It does happen in the Catholic Church. It did then. I think that priest was, I think the military presence was quite frightening to all people. And probably, some guy thought he was doing the right thing by saying, watch out for those nuns because they're inciting riots. I think that's probably, and so, he wanted to walk the straight and narrow and not have the military come down on him. Dorothy was even at some point, and it's still not clear to me, she had to go into hiding when she was in that area, that those border cities, towns, villages, when the military was pretty active, because I guess a group of probably, we might say, right wingers went after her, and so some of the farmers took her and put her someplace, and she was able to come back. But still, in all, that was pretty scary time.
Who was convicted and then out on parole? Who was the actual killer?
Well, the actual killer was what I call a dumb ranch hand. Poor guy. I mean, one of the two people who were sowing the seeds of the grass seed were one of them. I'm trying to remember, their names wouldn't mean anything.
Yeah,
they were Brazilian, probably uneducated ranch hands to whom the rancher gave the gun to his foreman, and the foreman gave it to those two guys. So, not me, I didn't do it, that kind of thing. And
Can you talk about Phoebe's
just a minute. Let me go. Christina?
Yeah. So Bibi's conviction was overturned, I think 2 years later.
He does. Yes.
Well,
It was. It was overturned twice because he went back in again.
You're talking about the peasant man who was accused.
The guy who ordered the killing.
Okay.
Right. The guy who ordered the killing, ostensibly the guy or the consortium working through Bida, what was his name? Something de Moura. He is the one who was convicted of conspiracy. That was he wasn't convicted of killing. He was convicted of the conspiracy to kill Sister Dorothy. He was in Brazil. You can only be convicted of that for 29 years. You could be put away for that long. He came out a year later of jail on an appeal. Then, because they had a wonderful prosecutor and also an attorney general of, I guess, of Pará, they managed to find other things to put him back. And he had a partner who could have gone into jail as well, but he had an accident. And I don't think it was I think it was, in truth, I asked about that, and it was really an accident. So this guy Bida had to take the rap in jail, but then again, he got out again on appeal. And now there's not really any legal work being done, is what I found out about that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Erin Brannon, you wanted to talk?
Yeah, well, I'm always interested in larger interests or larger issues involved. And so my question is, were you able, or did you look into whose ox was being gored by these women beyond the ranchers. What was the role of the United States in Brazil at that time,
Well,
and multinational corporations? And why
Carlisle.
wasn't there more of an outcry about this from the United States?
Well, they basically left them alone pretty much at the time. I mean, they were doing rightly so. They were really starting with Bible work. They weren't there stirring up the pot for a revolution. But at the same time, as the people began to understand their rights, they were getting more and more. And, you know, there had already been, even before Dorothy's time, with Paulo Freire, the educator, there was a certain, there was stuff brewing, let us say, at that point. In terms of the role of the states, as I say, Dorothy, when she wrote in her letters, she definitely felt there was some kind of neocons doing work, but she was not really, they stayed away pretty much from doing anything political other than demonstrations, for sure, you know, that they would have, but they were in Brazil for Brazil. So and they were looking for better pay, or they were looking for health care or whatever.
Anyone else with a hand?
No.
Peter.
Peter, husband.
Peter, you've got to unmute yourself.
You're still muted.
There you go.
I think I know the answer, but what else have you done for the sisters lately? And what's your sense of what they're still capable of doing?
Well, I think they're capable of doing a lot, as you know. As a result of this book and doing some talks, I became the chair of the Notre Dame Mission Volunteers AmeriCorps group. That I chaired that for a few years. The great volunteer group for largely the belief for the, I would say, is about education for whatever. And the AmeriCorps program was putting students post-college into both schools and after-school programs and so forth. And I, you know, did a lot of site visits for them, and then got involved with another project with the sisters of building a bakery in Haiti, and which was pretty amazing. We raised some money, and they now have almost, it sounds like a lot, 100 employees of a bakery. The bakery probably has about 20 employees, and the rest are sellers, and they go around in motorcycles and on foot. And in fact, they now have a truck, and they sell bread in a particular part, Lake Kai, which is in the southeast of Haiti. And you know, and now there's a big water project. There's a water project in Africa, and there's a water project in Haiti that's related. There's a photovoltaic project in Africa. So they don't stop. And they're really amazing women for the most part, which is why I continue to affiliate with them.
Judy Berman, did you want to ask something? No?
No, yeah, I did. I was unmute. I was
Oh.
finding my unmute button. Sorry. Well, one of the pieces that I'm sort of fascinated by is what the culture was like before. You know, you said that they didn't have a sense of community, and you know, I mean, certainly when I mean, this is totally naive, prejudice, whatever. I don't know. I think of tribes living in the Amazon. I don't really think about kind of individuals just kind of going out, you know. So what was the culture, and how much of an intervention really was this idea of settling down, building schools, you know, how,
right,
like, you know.
Well, first of all, you're right that there's still many indigenous tribes, you know, not villages, but indigenous communities that are there, but they generally are not mixing with the peasant settlers who came. The peasant settlers came because they heard that there was, and in fact, the government dropped them off. They flew people from the favelas of southern Brazil to the Amazon. and gave them, as I said, it gave them a shovel and a hoe, and I mean, very crude way of settling land, but they were looking to settle that land. Some of the people were, some of the government people were. And so they were, as I said, I think they were largely peasants who were the sons and grandsons of slaves. I mean, Brazil had a huge slave trade, which, you know, most of us didn't know at the time. You know, at the time, we always think of that triangle trade thing. But in fact, I think I read that 40% of all slaves went to Brazil from Africa. It's a lot. And so the culture, what there basically wasn't much of a culture. I mean, they tried, I will say, the sisters, that was one of the things that I knew from the beginning, is that first year that they went to Brazil and they were trained, so, and they saw the poverty in the cities, but at the same time they had to get a handle on how they were going to communicate with those people, the others who were illiterate, and how would they enrich their faith, which is really was faith-based, building of faith-based stuff. But the culture of Brazil, or the ruling class, is quite different than it is now for this group. Am I answering that in a way? I'm not sure.
No, I think so, but you know, it's, and again, this is one of these kind of just leaps, you know, in my
Right.
brain. You know, I hear settlers and I think about Israel and Palestine, you know, the Palestinians and things like that. And so I do find myself kind of wondering, not, this isn't, you know, I fully believe that the sisters would go there for the good of humanity and all of that. But I'm just sort of wondering that larger political context, the idea of shuttling of the government, bringing people from the South to the North to settle land that people live on, you know, and that ranchers are trying to cut, you know, I'm sort of trying to make sense of the sort of the, even though the individuals were not political, the environment has to be sort of political, right? I mean, there's something going on there, you know?
Yes, there was. As far as I can see, and I understand, and I think I'm right, it was extremely messy, if you will. There's huge amount of land, and some members of Congress in Brazil and some ranchers had these big plots of land. I don't know if they even knew where their land ended and where public land started. I mean, I think it was that much land, and that, you know, this whole thing with, I mean, I tell you what I know from that, but I don't know. And that's why there are two films. The one that I excerpted from is called The Student, the Nun, and the Amazon. And it's exactly that fellow that you might have seen quickly in the interview. It was the one who did the first film. And it was really about him learning about Dorothy's work in the environment. The other one is called And They Killed Sister Dorothy. Some of you might have seen it. It's a 90-minute documentary, but it doesn't go so much into it's really on the side of justice again. So it paints those southern lawyers in not a particularly attractive way. But what you see in that film, And They Killed Sister Dorothy, is a certain segment of the ranchers talking to the camera. And they're basically saying, this is our land. And why are, you know, she was taking the land for these people and they don't belong there. So there is, if it's not political at that point in time, at least there is that kind of West Bank, Gaza kind of, you know, I mean, there is something to be said for that. And it's, I can't tell you more except to know that my heart was in the fact that they were improving the lot of people. And, you know, that was kind of what attracted me, I guess I would say.
Karen got her hand up again.
Something that a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know until very recently, is that a fairly large group of Southern slave owners moved down to Brazil at the end of the Civil War, or when they saw what was, you know, how things were going down. And there's a group down there still that call themselves Confederates.
Really?
And, you know, most of them, I had a great uncle that went down, and he couldn't handle it for very long. It was just too tough, and so he came back. But apparently they're still down there. They celebrate the Confederacy and they fly the Confederate flag. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of these ranchers hadn't come from Georgia originally.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Roberta, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the work continues. The work continues. Is it making a difference?
I would say for people who live on the Project for Sustainable Development and have their ranch or their farm, it certainly has made a tremendous difference for, and if you, I wish I had this film of the two sisters who are working there now. And I think, yes, Dorothy's work made a difference. It's very tough now with the Bolsonaro regime to get anything new going, or I think to get any legislation that's needed. But it certainly has bettered the lot of some of these people who would never have had what they have now, I think.
And they're holding their own, these people?
Some of them are, I think. Apparently, I was just talking to one of the nuns today about, or maybe it was, I don't know, it was yesterday. She said that one of the things now is that some people, if they want to sell their lot, their plot, the newcomers may not want to respect the 80% that they're supposed to reforest. And I don't know if I even said that, but with the 250 acres that you get in the Project for Sustainable Development, you are supposed to reforest 80% of that. 20% is what you get to live on. Well, that's 50 acres. So it's quite a decent amount of land, I think. But yeah, I think it's still, I mean, people are moving there is what they said. They are people who like the idea of going there.
Good people.
I think good people. I think good people. I hope
good people moving there. Yeah, I hope so.
I don't think there are problems, major problems within the settlements, but I think that, you know, for a while, oh, I know what, and one of them told me recently, they're no longer killing people. What they're doing is besmirching their reputations. So there's a priest.
Who's smirching reputation?
Story, you'll get an idea. So there was a priest called Father Amaro, who was a protege of Dorothy's, and he was the one now sort of designated to kind of lead the movement, if you will. So first they accused him of embezzling, and then and he was looked at for that, and he was brought up on charges. And then the next thing he was is now they're saying that there was some sexual business that went on, and he's in house arrest at the bishop's house in Altamira. He can't leave. So did he do any of that? I don't know. I mean, what do I know? I saw him once outside the trial with a group of people from his community. But this is what she said. They're no longer killing people to get them off the land. They're just trying to make them say they're bad people, whatever.
Well, thank you, Michele, for introducing us to a whole different community and a whole different set of problems. Everybody clap.
Thank you. Oh, thank you a lot. I enjoyed it. I did.
And remember that next month it will be Connie Citro talking to us about what happened in the 2020 census. See you next month.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
You can go off mute and say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
If you want to.
Thanks, Michele.